Hello and welcome back. In this section of this week's presentation, I want to talk a little bit about how the idea of so-called Yugoslavism develops. That is, the idea that there is a basic unity to South Slavic languages, cultures, and people, a degree of unity that is sufficient for the formation of a state. However, I do want to make one point in the beginning, and this is a point that becomes more important as political developments go on over the course of the 20th century, and that is that we tend to talk about Southeast Europe as being a South Slavic region. In fact, there are populations in there that are South Slavic and populations that are not South Slavic, so that the idea of a fundamental unity of Slavic people, whether this idea is a plausible one or not, is never a concept that has applied to all of the people living in the region. You have populations there that are not Slavic, including Greeks, Romanians, Albanians, Italians, Germans, Hungarians. You have two, I think, differences among the populations that are Slavic that may or may not be sufficient for feelings of cultural and ethnic and national difference to be stronger than feelings of cultural and national and ethnic unity. But I think what is important in this context is that this question of basic unity was always raised as a question. It was never taken as given or as established. But let's talk about the movement for unification of the South Slavs. The first important expressions of it you see developing in what is now Croatia in the not the 1930s, the 1830s. One of the main figures in this movement was Ludovic Guy, one of the people who is regarded as one of the founders of what became the Serbo-Croatian language, is now maybe and is maybe not one or more languages. And he develops his concept based on, he does not use the term Yugoslav, but he refers to the ancient province of Illyria, says that all of Southeast Europe is a part of the ancient province of Illyria. There are basic similarities between the peoples there, and this is a cultural project. It is a project of intellectuals. One of the first things that Ludovic Guy does, this is typical of national movements in the 19th century, is to develop and to try to codify what he regards as the common language in the region. Now we're going to talk about language in much more detail in another one of our sessions. There is a lot that can be said about similarity and difference in practices that are related to language, but this was one of the important projects of the 19th century, led by people like Grimm and Herder. The idea that there exists something called a nation that is based on ethnicity and memory, but primarily on a shared language and literature. And Ludovic Guy was one of the people operating in the region that we're concerned with, promoting this idea of a shared culture and language and literature. His ideas are developed further later on in the 19th century by people again, Croatian intellectuals who allied their cultural project to a project of political unity of the South Slav populations within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, with the idea that they ought to form a political bloc to represent the interests of South Slavs in the empire, probably also inspired by the example of Hungary, which after a rebellion in 1848 had gained separate representation and autonomy as a part of the empire, which became the so-called dual monarchy of Austria and Hungary. Part of this project was that Austria-Hungary, or to claim that Austria-Hungary could, if it could be a dual monarchy, could also be a triple monarchy, with autonomous governance for parts of the Slavic population. So Strossmayer and Raczki participate in this project again as a movement of intellectuals, primarily founded on projects involving language, literature, the establishment of a canon of cultural heritage, and their great institutional achievement is the establishment of the Yugoslav Academy of Arts and Sciences, so an institution of intellectuals designed to establish a kind of cultural, scientific, and historic heritage for what they called Yugoslavs, meaning all South Slavs. This was established in Zagreb, in what's Croatia, in 1866, and it continued to carry this name until 1991, when it became the Croatian Academy of Arts and Sciences, still operating out of the same building in Zagreb. Now, these projects of unity of South Slavs based on cultural commonality and shared memory and history competed at the time with the political ambitions of the first independent state on the territory of what would later become Yugoslavia, and that was Serbia. Serbia was a semi-independent state, but it was one that had ambitions itself to try to unify all of the South Slavic people, not as a federation in the way that was proposed by the Yugoslavists operating out of Zagreb, but as a set of territories which are all in one degree or another, to a greater or lesser extent with some differences, fundamentally Serbian. So this Serbian version of the unification of South Slavs really projected a kind of incipient or latent Serbian identity onto all of the territories of the region. Kosovo, with its large Albanian population, was Serbian because of the importance of this region in Serbian history. Croatia, what would later become Croatia, with its large Catholic population, was populated by, in this view, Catholic Serbs, Bosnia and Herzegovina by Muslim Serbs, and so on. That is, one way or another, every territory was somehow or was potentially Serbian, and this is developed by Ilija Gorašanin, who was foreign minister and important advisor to early governments of Serbia. He writes the Načrtanje, that is this outline of an overall strategy, in 1844, where he says that Serbia ought to play the role for Southeast Europe, something like Piedmont plays in Italy, that is, as the base around which all of the territories unite to form a common state. Of course, this is tied to political ambition. The state would be under the political control of elites in Serbia, and this forms the foundation for a number of national strategies that will come afterward. But all of this really stays on the level of long-term ambitions, dreams, and so on. Realizing these projects seems to be impossible given the power of the Austro-Hungarian and the Ottoman empires in the region and the way that they limit, or were able to limit, the ambitions of states. The movement becomes more popular with the decline of these empires, particularly in the early 20th century. But let me step back a little bit. Probably the most important moment is in 1848, when Austria gives up exclusive control of the Habsburg Empire. It becomes the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the dual monarchy. That is, a degree of autonomy and independence is provided for the Hungarian-controlled part of the empire, and this gives rise to ambitions among other national groups in the empire, who say that if Hungary can get an equal footing in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then so can other groups. A second important moment probably comes. The Austro-Hungarian Empire takes over administrative control of Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1878, but in 1908 they annex the territory entirely. It becomes a territory. It becomes a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and what this establishes is rise in sentiments in the region of what I guess in the contemporary context you might call anti-imperialist. That is, the image of the region as being subject to foreign domination, and the sense that this is unjust becomes more popular, and so national liberation movements of various kinds become stronger. And some of these are tied to the Serbian project, the successors to the projects that were outlined by Ilya Gerasimov. Some of them become tied to the Yugoslav idea that was promoted by intellectuals in Zagreb. Some of them are projects of so-called national liberation, that is, projects attempting to create nations that would be where political power would be carried by a titular group. This becomes stronger as the Ottoman Empire gradually loses power in the region over the course of the 19th century, with the establishment of a number of national states, most of which have Slavic majorities, that is, people speaking Slavic languages, and in most of them majority of the Orthodox religion, and with this also enters a new competitor into the region. Russia attempts to pose itself as the protector of Slavs across Europe, and in a way enters the competition for power that had been going on for a long time between the Ottoman and the Austro-Hungarian empires. Now, one of the big questions about the establishment of states, if we take as a given that the states that are going to be established are going to be national states, is what is the nation that forms the states? Are all of the people in the state members of the same nation? And so a big part of the promotion of the idea of unity of all of the South Slav nations, of Yugoslavism, was the attempt to establish a kind of shared culture, a shared cultural heritage, shared literature, and shared language. And this was a project in which writers and artists played a very large role. And I want to concentrate on one of these, a sculptor from Croatia, Ivan Meštrović. And Ivan Meštrović attempted to create heroic images. All of the images that he creates are bulky, are imposing, are overwhelming, that are based upon elevation of regional myths and the promotion of myths from a particular region of Southeast Europe to expand over all of them. He drew very heavily on Serbian mythology, but not only on Serbian mythology. In one of these pictures here, the top one in the middle, you can see the bust that he created of Franjo Rački, one of the founders of the Yugoslav Academy of Arts and Sciences. In others of them, you see figures from the epic poetry and traditional folklore of the region. What he wanted to do is to draw out of history a selection of heroic images of South Slavic shared identity and promote them as symbols of what he hoped would become the new nation. At the bottom in the middle here, you see his figure of the victor in the war, and this is a figure you can still see. It is on the shore of the confluence of the Danube and the Sava rivers in the largest urban park in Belgrade. His sculptures remain prominent and probably also remain popular throughout the region. So he is considered one of the innovators of this Yugoslav idea, and particularly the innovator of the idea of the shared culture. In his work, you can also see some of the tensions about this idea of the shared culture. Because he was selective in his use of sources, he drew more heavily from mythology that was related to Serbian culture and literature than other groups and other peoples in the region, and this became a source of controversy. Similarly with the First World War, a lot of the mythology of the First World War attributes its beginning to the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife in Sarajevo in 1914. The person who actually carried out this killing after a series of failures of the conspiracy was Gavrilo Princip. Most of the stories of Gavrilo Princip in standard histories will tell you knew that he was a mercenary, that he was an agent of a conspiracy of officers in the Serbian military seeking to destabilize Austro-Hungarian control in Bosnia and Herzegovina. An alternative narrative has developed that may or may not be more persuasive, that Gavrilo Princip was acting not as an agent of Serbia, but as somebody interested in the liberation equally of all peoples in the region. That is, he is sometimes presented as having been a Yugoslav nationalist who, through a series of failures that were destructive to him personally, also accomplished the success of the establishment of Yugoslavia. But Gavrilo Princip, I would say, remains a highly disputed figure, and one of the centers of the dispute was what he was promoting, a kind of Serbian vision, an articulation of the Načrtanje by Garašanin, of the establishment of a state encompassing the entire region under the control of Serbia, or was he more of a Yugoslav? It is interesting that he was celebrated both by the interwar Royal Yugoslavia, which was dominated by Serbian nationalist forces, and by the post-World War II communist regime that drew more heavily on ideas of the unity and equality of peoples. World War I is the moment that is crucial for the transformation of this idea of Yugoslavia from a cultural project into a state project. The principal negotiators in this were the guy with the big beard there that you see in the picture leaning over the table is Nikola Pasic, the longtime prime minister of Serbia, who sought to establish control of Serbia, of territories over which the Austro-Hungarian Empire would eventually lose control. The other fellow, the one with the glasses there, is Ante Trumbic, the head of the Yugoslav Committee, a group of politicians and intellectuals, principally from Croatia. Both of them were represented at the Paris Peace Conferences, and it is the compromise between, mostly, Pasic and Trumbic that lead to the establishment of Yugoslavia as a unified state, but as a unified state containing and embodying and weakened from the beginning by the same tensions that I have just mentioned. Now again, I bring up Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points, including the most important point, the self-determination of nations, at the end of this, simply to underline the fact. All of the new states that were created at the end of the First World War were created on the basis of the principle of self-determination of nations and of peoples. All of them were subject to tension because there was lack of consensus as to what constitutes a nation and what constitutes a people, which led to conflicts over political control in these states. This was a particular problem in Yugoslavia, and in the next segment of this presentation, I want to talk a bit about how these tensions became expressed in the first iteration of Yugoslavia, in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia that was established after the First World War.